Welcome to Spooky Halls. Tonight's episode, The Devils Giftshop Part 2 by Doom Dragon 682.
Sarah was having a bad day. Not just a bad day, but a god-awful day. She was clocking out after a lengthy and irritating shift. She had to deal with a customer threatening to sue them because they refused to serve them something that they never had on their menu. And her boss had gotten onto her for not handling the situation well. As though that wasn't bad enough, her boyfriend of 5 years broke up with her over text because it wasn't working out and wouldn't answer any of her messages. Sarah wanted to just lie in bed and play games, but when she went back to her apartment, she was greeted with a power outage in her complex. She changed into a casual outfit in the dark and decided to go on a walk. It was late at night and she needed to clear her head. As Sarah walked, she decided to take a different route than normal. She wasn't entirely sure what possessed her to go down a road she's never taken, but she figured that maybe a change of scenery is what she needed. It didn't take long before she paused in front of a creepy-looking store. The sign above the door read, "The Devils Giftshop." She had never seen the store before and was certainly curious. Sarah opened the door and wasn't disappointed to find that the store was just what she was expecting. The place was full of shelves with all kinds of spooky items. She saw a large egg with a sign reading, "Genuine Basilisk Egg," and a dummy, a creepy dummy, wearing a suit whose eyes seemed to follow her around. Sarah noticed a faded tag next to the dummy and could barely make out the first few letters, "Sla." Sarah debated what that meant, but before she could continue that train of thought, she noticed a dark red stain on the floor across from the front desk. She pondered what it could be when a deep voice from behind startled her out of her thoughts.
May I help you, ma'am?
Sarah whipped around to face whoever spoke and was surprised to find not a creepy old shopkeeper, but a handsome older man who wore black dress pants and shoes, along with a white undershirt and a gray vest with a tie that looked red as blood. The man seemed less like a creepy shopkeeper and more like a character from an old vampire movie. The man grinned at her, showing off pearly white teeth, and spoke again.
Sorry to startle you, ma'am. My name is Mr. Memphis. Welcome to my shop.
Sarah thought the name sounded odd, but didn't want to be rude. She forced a smile and extended a hand. "Nice to meet you. My name's Sarah." Mr. Memphis shook her hand, and Sarah noticed that his hand was much warmer than hers. He nodded to the stain on the floor.
Pardon the stain. I meant to have it cleaned, but I like to think it adds to the mood of the place. Makes everything a bit more creepy.
Sarah couldn't help but agree. It looked so much like blood she was almost worried. But in a shop like this, stuff like that was to be expected. Mr. Memphis gestured to the many shelves and smiled at her.
Feel free to browse. If you need anything, just call.
He turned and walked into the shelves, disappearing without a sound and leaving Sarah to her own devices. She wandered the store, seeing jars of what she hoped to be fake eyes and shrunken heads that looked pretty realistic to her. At the back of the store, she saw a single shelf that took up a large section of the wall. On it rested 6 items: a book, a mirror, a locket, a small mannequin, a wallet, and a medal, and a spot that seemed to be empty. Each one seemed odd, but Sarah found herself attracted to the book. She lifted it up and was surprised to find that it felt warm in her hands. The fur felt rough and scratchy and reminded her of Velcro. Sarah opened the book and almost dropped it. On the first page was a detailed drawing of a man facing outwards to her and screaming. He was holding up his hands as though he was defending himself from something. The next 3 pages showed similar things. She noticed a name written at the bottom of each page. What was this? Someone's sketchbook for a horror comic or cartoon or something? The pictures were so detailed that she almost mistook them for photos. Suddenly, Mr. Memphis appeared next to Sarah. He was so quiet that she hadn't even noticed him until he spoke.
Ah, I see something's caught your eye. That's quite the item you have there.
She turned to him, a bit startled by his sudden appearance, but she didn't let it show. What do you mean? Isn't it just some kind of sketchbook? Mr. Memphis seemed to grin even wider.
Oh, no, my dear. This is no mere sketchbook. This is a book that destroys your enemies.
She raised an eyebrow, almost certain that the shopkeeper was trying to pull some kind of joke or something. Mr. Memphis took a notice of her look and chuckles.
I know it sounds quite far-fetched, ma'am, but I assure you it's genuine. And even if it isn't, then what's the harm?
Sarah thought that over for a bit. She did enjoy writing, and had been meaning to get a new book. So even if this was a dud, then she'd at least have a new book to write in. She decided to purchase it. The book was a bit expensive, but Mr. Memphis assured her it was because it was such high quality. She was on her way out the door when he spoke up.
Oh, and you will need this.
Mr. Memphis produced a jet black pen from his pocket. Sarah took the pen and thanked him once more. Mr. Memphis smiled at her.
Of course, Sarah. Enjoy yourself.
She said her goodbyes, and it wasn't until she was outside that she realized what he had said. Had she ever told him her name? Sarah was about to turn around and knock, but stopped when she realized that all the lights were off. She didn't want to bother him after closing and went home. Once there, she decided to get out a bottle of wine she had been saving for a special occasion, and given how stressful today was, she figured today was that occasion. Sarah had finished about half the bottle when she remembered the book. In her drunken state, she decided to test it out. She grabbed a pen from her desk and wrote the first name that came to mind, her now ex-boyfriend. With that, Sarah laid on her couch, put on a rerun of some old sitcom, and passed out. That night, Sarah had a nightmare. In it, she saw her ex standing in his bathroom shaving. Suddenly, he looked at something in the mirror and whipped around. He let out a blood-curdling scream as something lunged at him from the shadows. Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of her phone ringing. She rubbed her face and groaned, the nightmare fading and being replaced by an unpleasant headache. She didn't drink often and didn't have much of a tolerance for it. She groaned and picked up her phone. It was a call from her boss asking her to come in early. As much as Sarah wanted to stay home and do nothing, she also needed the money. So she threw on her uniform and made her way to the door, but paused a few feet short. Out of the corner of her eyes, she caught a glimpse of the book laying open on the table. It was opened and laying in the same spot she left it on last night. But now there was an incredibly detailed drawing on the page where she had written her ex's name. It showed him with leftover shaving cream on his chin and a towel around his waist, screaming and holding his hand up to protect himself from something. Sarah was confused, but also running late. As she made her way to work, she debated what had happened. Maybe she had drawn it in her drunken state, but she had never made anything that detailed in her life. Anything better than a stick figure was practically a masterpiece compared to her. But if she didn't draw it, then who did? Eventually, Sarah has to push these thoughts to the back of her head as she focused on work. And by the end of the day, she was so tired she could barely think about it. She walked home, turned on the TV to the news as she changed out of her work clothes, but soon froze as she heard the reporter reading the headlines.
In some unsettling news, a local man was found dead in his apartment early this morning. Officials say that the cause of death is unknown, but suspect some type of large animal due to his injuries being so severe that his body had to be identified by dental records. So far, no leads have shown up as to what specifically is responsible, but the chief of police has assured everyone that this matter will be dealt with and the animal responsible will be found.
Sarah didn't know how long she stood in front of the TV for. She was snapped out of her stupor by a heavy knocking at the door. She quickly finished putting on her shirt and ran to answer. Standing outside her door were two policemen. One looked to be middle-aged. One had dark brown hair and thick mustache. The other was much younger, likely new, and had blonde hair and blue eyes. He had a serious look on his face and tapped his foot impatiently. When Sarah opened the door, the older man greeted her.
Evening, ma'am. I'm Officer Grant, and this is Officer Jones. We'd like to ask you some questions. Mind if we come in?
Sarah nodded and opened the door, unsure what to say or do. The two officers stepped in and looked around. Her apartment was a mess, but she hadn't had time to clean it as of late. Officer Grant turned to her.
Do you know a man named Jake Turner?
She nodded. Yes, sir. He's my ex. As soon as she said that, she saw Officer Jones scribble something onto a notepad. Then he looked up at her.
Are you aware that Mr. Turner is dead?
Yes. I just heard about it on the news. She gestured to her TV, which still had the news broadcast on. Officer Jones nodded and scribbled something in his notepad once more. Sarah couldn't help but feel like he was suspicious of her. Officer Grant produced another photo, this one of a heavy-set man, roughly her age, and seemed to be a driver's license photo.
And do you recognize this man as well?
Sarah shook her head. She'd never seen him before in her life.
He went missing about a week ago, and we're searching for any leads. His disappearance might be linked to the other man's death.
Both officers questioned her for some time before eventually leaving. They left her a card with the police station's number and told her to call them if she had any leads. Sarah stared at the card before tossing it on the table and looking at the books. She kept expecting either officer to mention it, but neither seemed to notice it. She knew it was crazy. There was no way writing someone's name in a book could kill them. Although there was her dream last night, and the drawing that appeared in the morning. Sarah picked up the book, having every intention of throwing it away and never thinking about it again. But something stopped her. A small voice in the back of her head spoke up. Jake hadn't even been a good person anyway. He had a bad habit of stealing and always talked down to everyone. Maybe he deserved what he got. Sarah felt her body move, as though on autopilot, and set the book down on the table. The voice spoke up more, talking about how this was her chance to get back at all the people who had wronged her. Her body moved again. She wished she could say it was against her will, but in truth, she knew what she was doing, and was fully aware as she wrote the name of her boss. The next day followed a similar pattern to the last. A news report about the attack and a visit from the police. Again they found nothing and thanked Sarah for her time. She felt herself getting excited and soon made a habit of writing names in the book, at least once a day. At first she only wrote the names of those she thought deserved it, but soon it became worse. Sarah wrote the name of kids who bullied her in high school, old crushes who broke her heart, even an employee who blamed her for every little thing that went wrong at work. It was when Sarah set her sights on an old friend that things fell apart. In middle school, she had a friend named Sarah Mittis. They both had a crush on the same boy, and her friend spread all kinds of rumors about her and her family. Sarah had never forgiven her for that. Her entire middle school life was hell because of that girl. Sarah grinned as she began writing the name, and that grin quickly faded when she ran out of ink. She scribbled the pen across the paper, but nothing came out. She reached for another pen, but was shocked when she found that it left no marks on the paper before her. Sarah scribbled harder, but still nothing came out. And then she became uneasy when she realized what she had written just before the pen had given out. Written on the page in front of her, in letters so bold they seemed to take up the whole page despite only being written in the top corner, were the words, "Sarah, me." Sarah felt a ball of fear in her guts as she stared down at the words. She tried to convince herself that it was fine, that there was no way the book would take those two words to mean herself. But her hands shook as she desperately searched her drawers for a bottle of whiteout. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard scratching on the roof as she heavily applied it to the page over the words she had written. And she felt her stomach drop as the letters slowly bled through the layer of whiteout in front of her. Sarah quickly picked up the book and froze when she heard a creak from her bedroom. Rather than wait to find out what it was, she quickly ran out the door and down the street. If she could just get to the shop, then maybe Mr. Memphis could fix this. Maybe he'd help her. It was dark outside as she ran. Thick clouds covered the moon and stars, and the only light came from windows and the street lamps. Sarah found herself desperately wishing a car would drive by her with its high beams on, or a jogger with a flashlight would appear. She was halfway there when she heard something like thousands of feet all scurrying at once. Though it wasn't quite feet, it was more like hands. Sarah desperately searched the darkness for the source of the noise as she ran, but whatever it was stayed in the darkness of the shadows that surrounded her. Soon Sarah came up to the shop and desperately pounded her fist against the door. She got no response and was afraid it wouldn't open. She had almost given up hope when it silently swung open and she ran in, slamming it behind her and pressing her back against it. The shop was dark, except for a single light shining down from the ceiling in front of the desk, creating a circle of light. Sarah quickly ran to it and began calling for the shopkeeper, but was greeted with only silence. Just as she was about to give up hope, a voice spoke from in the darkness behind her. It sounded like Mr. Memphis, but dark and distorted somehow.
"Hello, Sarah. What brings you to my shop so late?"
Sarah whipped around and strained to see the shopkeeper in the all-encompassing darkness. She could barely make out his figure behind the counter. I've made a mistake," she shuddered. "I wrote my name in the book and I can't erase it. Please, I need help." Sarah heard a chuckle from the darkness. It was not the same pleasant chuckle she heard from the same man just a week or so before, but a sound full of malice, as though he enjoyed seeing her distraught and panicked.
"Oh, Sarah,"
he spoke from the darkness.
"There are no accidents with these types of things. You got exactly what you wanted."
Sarah felt anger and confusion from inside her. What did he mean? She never wanted anything like this. She was about to open her mouth, not sure if it was to yell at the figure in the darkness or demand an explanation, when it stepped closer to the light, and she felt her voice die in her throat. The thing that stood in the darkness was not the same man who'd sold her the book. His blue eyes were replaced by blood-red ones. His pearly white teeth were now yellow and razor-sharp. His fingers no longer ended in manicured nails, but long, sharp claws. The thing in front of her smiled maliciously and placed a hand on the wall. Sarah squinted into the darkness and saw his hand resting on a light. The thing, which she could only assume was the true form of Mr. Memphis, seemed to smile even wider as he saw the look of shock and fear on Sarah's face. She took an involuntary step back when she heard another noise from behind. She turned and saw a massive shape in the darkness. It came closer, and she felt the blood drain from her face. A nightmare stood before her. Its body, if you could call it that, was a withering mass of large, powerful hands bound together by what seemed to be vines. Where a face would be was instead a camera that reflected her own terrified face back at her through the darkness. Sarah saw the nails of each hand ended in long, jagged claws and could easily tear the flesh from her body. Sarah had almost found the power to scream when Mr. Memphis spoke again.
I told you, Sarah. The book destroys your enemies. You simply don't know who your enemies are.
With that, she heard two sounds. The sound of the light switch clicking off, and a click from the monster in the shadows as it fell on her in the darkness. Mr. Memphis sighed as the screams of his latest filled the store. The book slid across the room and bumped against his foot. He picked it up and watched as a picture of the young woman's face bled onto the page with such fine detail. After the creature had finished its work, it sank back into the shadows from which it was born, and he looked at the remains of her body and thought to himself,
I really must put down a rug in that spot. Something cheap and easy to replace.
He took the book to the back and placed it on the shelf next to the jar containing a chittering creature, desperate to fill a hunger that can never be satisfied. Mr. Memphis left the back of the store to clean the mess, excited to see who his next customer would be. This was turning out to be more fun than he was expecting.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Spooky Halls. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to check out our other videos and to subscribe. Thank you, and good night.